or you might recognize, but you might reject, you might hate, you might want to destroy someone or this beauty wherever it exists. And in fact, the reality of Satan, of Shaitan, is that Shaitan is constantly in a state of rebellion against al-husna, against the state of beauty. The state of salam, consciousness of salam, is fundamentally antithetical to the satanic condition. I mean, all of this is so elementary that as Muslims, you say, yeah, we all know this, right? And or for Muslims, they all know, well, we know this, but if you unpack it step by step, much of the present condition starts becoming quite troublesome, which pushes you into wanting to investigate, well, so how did we get here? So you would ask, well, and again, and as I said yesterday, often the Muslim theologians would ask things in the hypothetical, and so for instance, they would say, well, is it imaginable for, if one would imagine a state of someone having attained Dar es Salaam on this earth, attained the abode of peace within, because it's not a territorial category, it is a state of consciousness, right? And let's assume that someone has truly attained it, truly become a Muslim, attained the level of Islam. Is it imaginable this person would be torn by envy, greed, lies, deceit? I mean, just intuitively, if I ask you, someone claims that they've attained the level of abode of salam within, right? The abode of peace. They've become the true embodiment of Islam. And say, but let's assume that somehow we have a way to know reality, and you discover that the reality of this person is envy, right? A lot of ugly feelings, anxiety, hatred, jealousy, etc. Would you say that's consistent or inconsistent with the claim of the abode of salam? Inconsistent, right? It is not imaginable for Muslim theologians that any of these qualities can be consistent with a state of true Islam. And when you push further, you say, well, can I create legal exceptions by somehow showing that, well, under these circumstances, a lie might be okay, or sort of exceptions. So if I create legal exceptions, do I change the theological reality? That's the question that Muslim theologians or in the they would confront. So if I say, well, it's sometimes good to teach my son to be envious so that they'll want to compete to do better in school, have I then proven that you can be in a true state of salam, true state of being Muslim, and be an envious person? If I show that sometimes a lie would save lives, can you be in a true state of salam and at the same time be a liar? If I show that sometimes you need to, there are bandits that are terrorizing your town, and so you need to make an example you capture some of them and you may need to make an example of them, so you're terrorizing these bandits. So the Quran says terror is corruption on earth, right? Constantly fear is talked about as an equivalent to corruption on earth. Anxiety, fear, terror, horror. So you say, okay, well, if I then show legal circumstance where terror might be useful, have I then shown that you can be a true Muslim, perfect Muslim, but also at the same time person who aspires fear instead of tranquility and peace? Now, this is here. You know, it's like how a lot of time knowledge has keys. This hypothetical question that I just gave you is like a key to unpacking a lot of the knowledge of the theological disputations. In that, here there was a fundamental, decisive, if you will, pivotal turning point. The Khawarij, the first Puritans, they said, well, it cannot be possible that an exception would be lawful and at the same time would be inconsistent with what is good or bad. And so the Khawarij reasoned that, so we cannot rely on any sensory conditions to investigate a state of peace or a state of truthhood or a state of beauty or a state of tranquility. Instead, we must put our senses to the side and follow the what? The text, right?
Yeah.
So the theology becomes completely contingent on, dependent on the law. It follows the law. You know, the law goes and it drags the theology behind. Interestingly, the Ahlul Hadith or the Akhbaris, their response was, can you guess? It's a phrase.
Vice versa.
No.
The same?
No. Their response was, Bila kaif. Don't ask.
Oh.
Their response was actually what differentiates, maybe one of the very few things that differentiates them from the medieval Puritans, is that they said, listen, these are complicated questions, and this complexity is indication of temptations, of the workings of the devil, right, the imaginary. And so don't ask these types of questions. Just, okay, you know, don't come and ask me, just show me when I have to say the truth and when I can not say the truth. Effectively, although they claimed not to make theology completely contingent and dependent on law, effectively they abandoned theology to legal technicalities, because theological inquiry itself became an unacceptable inquiry. So you cannot ask the question of what is Hasan or what is Qabih, what is Hasan or what is beautiful or what is not beautiful or what is ugly. You cannot inquire as to the difference between what is Hasan and what is Ma'ruf, what is beautiful and what is acceptable or morally acceptable. And here it eventually becomes what is inherently ethical and what is ethical but depending on the circumstance, what is contingently or contextually ethical. The Ahlul Hadith basically said, okay, listen, God uses the word Hasan when God wants, God uses the word Ma'ruf when God wants. We don't know why God used this word here, we don't know why God used this word here, don't ask. And similarly, when in the Quran sometimes says, won't you reflect, right? Other times, at this point we talked about yesterday, won't you remember? Other times it says, won't you observe? أَلَا تَفَكَّرُونَ أَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ أَلَا تَذْكُرُونَ, right? The Wahhabi said, don't any attempt at exegesis where you say, the reason God used the word reflect here instead of remember here is because of X, Y, and Z. They said that's not illegitimate inquiry. As far as we're concerned, God could have used these words because they rhymed better. As far as we're concerned, we just don't know, we don't care, we don't ask. So you may not attempt to systematically try to say, well, on these types of moral questions, God uses the word أَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ, won't you reflect? And then that means that rational inquiry, for instance, would be permissible. And on these types of questions, God uses the word أَلَا تَذْكُرُونَ, won't you remember? So here, intuition or intuitive approaches might be acceptable. And on these type of questions, God says, won't you أَلَا تُبْصِرُونَ, won't you observe? So contextual ethics might be acceptable. If you open this inquiry, then you start tracing when the Quran uses the word reflect, observe, or remember. And as many theologians in Islamic history did, you start equating between, or you start finding parallels between reflect and use of reason, remember and the intuitive knowledge, and observe and what is socially contingent morality. And you start then arguing from these bases. Obviously, just trying to explain it to you, you start saying, there's complexity here. Well, this complexity produced allergic reactions with Ahlul Hadith. I mean, it is quite remarkable that in any text that the theologian would start producing a layered argument. It is as if the Ahlul Hadith could only imagine God being God if God is completely popularistic. It's sort of the lowest common denominator. It is, okay, what is, but a God that goes according to the lowest common denominator, although quite an accessible God, but it's also quite an impoverished God. How much, if any complexity is to be rejected, then how do we explain the notion of struggle in Islamic theology and attaining levels of higher consciousness until you attain the level of true Islam, right? If it's all black or white, it's all either flat or non-existent, then then by definition, the only purpose of a trial or tribulations is to just test your ability to be patient, but nothing more. It doesn't enrich your knowledge in any way. Human experience, pain, doesn't enrich you in any way. You don't learn anything from it. You just, as long as you keep doing your prayers, your fasting, your so on, then you've proven yourself. It's always a test as to your credibility, because your credibility is always suspect in the puritanical paradigm. So it's always, God is always testing your credibility, but God is never teaching you, never nourishing you. And interestingly, then the part of this, you would then, because the word Rabb means the nourisher. God is the nourisher. Ilah, God is the supreme. And the Quran uses both. Rabbuna, our God the nourisher, and Ilahuna, our God the supreme. And with their whole theology of Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, you remember in the theology about the two types of monotheism, and you know, I personally never figured out actually what they mean by it, because it's I mean, I know I'm sort of not being very honest, because I understand it intellectually, but it doesn't make sense to me. I have to, but you would then think that they would confront this inconsistency between their theological position would only seem to incorporate a supreme God who doesn't teach you anything, doesn't engage you in anything other than a credibility test, a judgment. But all other theological schools had rejected that notion of this God who is constantly testing your credibility to judge you, but doesn't engage in your elevation and illumination as a human being with human consciousness. Okay, is this clear? This is a very critical point for it's 3 o'clock, so let's take our break and come back. If you truly reflect on this, you will find as if you have a key to so much of the theological disputations or the unfolding of modern Islamic history. And if you go back and read the Quran, you will start noticing things you've never noticed before in the text of the Quran. And also you start demanding that, you start realizing why the precision in translation, for instance, being consistent when the Quran uses the word Rabb and when the Quran uses the word Ilah, is imperative to actually be able to engage this text, because you miss so much. I mean, it's quite typical. All the Qurans translated by the Saudi Arabia, they don't bother with any sense of the accuracy.
Does the thought like this, I mean, like what you say, yes, it is sort of is the key, but for the Puritanists, would say this kind of thought as imagination, as heretics?
They think that this is a violation of the precept of don't ask. I mean, the response is, God that elevates you and teaches you, and so why? Do you think you're a prophet? God is there to only judge you, and if you pass, God will reward you in very material, physical ways. As a famous Puritan theologian said, he was actually one of the students of Tahawi. He said that, I can read the text and see what my physical reward will be in terms of, fruits and sex and so on. And by God, if God gives me, I'm not, this is actually true, and I have the text. He says, by God, if God would deny me one session of sex that I was otherwise promised, I would sue God. I actually have this text. I actually translated Puritan speaking God's name initially, and then I took it out. Thought modern day Muslims might not be able to handle that, but okay. So let's take a break. I'm told that it's like I have to. The camera runs out, so not exactly at the time.
He's coming back on the tapes.
Yeah, he's
I saw him.
right on time. Yeah. I don't know if you noticed, like the first day. No, actually, you weren't here, but I think you were, right? The first day. We had this fellow who came who looked like he belonged to the Wahhabi school.
Yeah.
And he left.
Yeah, he's a lady student, but he told me that he was here for a meeting for someone else. And just he noticed you, then